scandals. Get any better than that? All right, we are recording. Hello, everybody who watches this later. Let's throw up our screen. Oh, yep. Naomi says hi. I got to go see Naomi's house finally. Oh, this is not the right thing. Whoops. There we go. Okay, we got the right screen. That looked good. Watergate. Here we go. What's our year?
1972.
1972. I would accept 74, but again, whatever. 72 is when they broke in. 74 is when he finally resigned. So either way is fine. But we'll go with 1972. We're talking about three things. Losing confidence. That's where we're going to be talking about the war. Which war?
The Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War. Nixon is the final president to preside over that. It was kind of started with Eisenhower, a little bit with Kennedy, then a lot with Johnson, and then ends under Nixon. Culture in crisis. That's where we're going to talk about kind of the 60s counterculture movement, the hippie movement, the protests and stuff, and then finally the actual Watergate conspiracy, Watergate scandal that causes the first presidential resignation in U.S. history. Okay, let's see. So losing confidence. Talk about a poorly managed war. Oh, here comes Ella, maybe. Okay, poorly managed war, Vietnamization, and détente. Again, we're talking about which war?
Vietnam.
Vietnam. Who had escalated the Vietnam War?
The Viet Cong.
They were the resistance. They were the insurgents, communist insurgents in southern Vietnam. But which American president actually kind of basically turned it from where they were advising the South on how to fight, and then actually put, a couple tens of thousands of troops in Vietnam?
Johnson.
Johnson, very good. Yeah, the whole point of our last summary was that with Kennedy's assassination brought in Johnson, and Johnson kind of shifted policies and really committed American troops to the war. And then the key thing there is I say the word committed is because what really, when we say a poorly managed war, it fought without clear objectives. That he committed a lot of troops, but it was never like, one of the key aspects to the U.S. winning in World War II was that they had a very good policy. They knew what they wanted to do. They knew what they were trying to achieve. And they said, you know what, this is our goal. We're going to give everything we have towards this goal. And even though they had some bad generals, even though there were mistakes made, troops, there were some bad tactical mistakes made in World War II. But because the overall war was a success, we don't remember those because the overall objectives were good and the war was managed pretty well. I'm not a big fan of FDR's New Deal, but the way FDR managed World War II was, for all I can tell so far, very good. Vietnam's the opposite of that. A war in which sometimes I think the troops get the blame, but the troops and the commanders, there's so many heroic stories from Vietnam and how well they fought. The American troops never lost a battle. They never lost. They got ambushed. They went on some missions that didn't produce success, but they never lost an open engagement with the Viet Cong or with the North Vietnamese forces. But their leadership from Johnson down was very poor. They never knew what exactly are we doing in Vietnam? What does it mean? How are we going to win? How are we going to end this? And nothing's worse than like struggling and not knowing what the end or the purpose of that struggle is. And so that's one of the things that really caused people to lose confidence in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, and again, that's kind of our overall story here. We're telling a story that under Nixon there's a failing confidence in Vietnam because people are like, well, what are we trying to achieve? The government would publish numbers of, oh, this is how many Viet Cong we've killed. This is how many North Vietnamese soldiers we've killed. But as far as like, well, what have you actually achieved? That was never very clear. And that was frustrating for both the soldiers and then also the people back home. And so that kind of fuels a lot of the protests because people are like, all they do is say they see the body count going up. And it really I mean, in the end, it was nothing close to like how many troops are lost in World War II. But if people don't know why their sons and brothers are dying, their fathers are dying, then people aren't going to put up with it. And that's kind of, you know, another way of looking at the Vietnam War. People just didn't know what the objectives were and why it was worth, I think, something like 50,000 lives, or however many people were actually killed in it. And so that feeds into the anti-war movement. And so by the time Nixon gets elected, Nixon's elected in 1968. And so he decides because Johnson could have run again, but he's so worn out by the Vietnam War that he says, I don't even want to run for another term.
And
So
wasn't he already unpopular anyway?
well, he was very unpopular. He was very unpopular because he was seen as the president who had took the U.S. into this. The word they often use was a thing called a quagmire, which is kind of a trap in which you can't get yourself out of. And so Nixon was elected on that mindset of, I'm going to slowly turn the war over to the Vietnamese soldiers themselves. That's what Vietnamization means. It means we're going to have the South Vietnamese fight for themselves, and we're going to go back to what we were doing initially. Is we'll train them, we'll support them, we'll even send, you know, air support and jets and munitions, but we're going to get our troops out of there because it's not. They're kind of like, it's not our fight. That was kind of
like,
that was Nixon's position.
But isn't Vietnam all? See, I don't think that really worked out too well in the sense that they didn't really eliminate communism in Vietnam, because now Vietnam's all communist, right?
Well, right, and that's going to be the end of what I'm going to describe, because so it starts with, well, we're going to pull our troops out, but we're going to support them militarily, or we're going to support them with advisors, we're going to support them with money, we're going to support them with planes and air power, and we'll help them fight on their own. But they need to do the fight. If they want a free country, they need to do the fighting. Something similar happened with Iraq just a few years ago. Now the problem with that is once the troops get out, then Congress does not want to fund it anymore. The war had become so unpopular, and this is where you might want to mention what protests kind of came to epitomize how bad things had gotten in the United States.
Kent State University.
Yeah, the Kent State University incident, in which the protests got so out of hand, and the ROTC building was burned down, and they were, you know, refusing to disperse, and they got looks like some trigger happy National Guardsmen, and they end up killing 4 students and I think wounding 7 or maybe a few more than that. You know, where you have, again, first of all, people are protesting the fact you've got American soldiers, you know, killing innocent Vietnamese. That's how they saw it. That's not necessarily what was happening. And then all of a sudden you have American National Guardsmen shooting American college students. People are just like, this is a bad situation. We want out. And so Nixon's Vietnamization was kind of a response to that. But then that basically what happens is the South tries to fight on their own for a little while, but then Congress cuts off the money. And so even though the U.S. pulls out its soldiers and says, hey, we'll still support you, within a few years, the U.S. stops supporting them, and the South loses. And so what Josh, you were saying is, once the troops are gone, and then once we're not sending in jets, and we're not sending in weapons, and we're not sending in money, the South falls. And so today, in the end of the conclusion of the Vietnam War, is that the North wins, and Vietnam is a fully communist country today. And that's why people say, you know, it was an official loss as far as a war in which the U.S. fought. And Nixon oversees that. He knows it's an unpopular war, and so his goal is to slowly pull us out. He didn't want to cut off the support, but by that time, Congress is the one who controls the money, and they said, no, we're not going to spend any more on Vietnam. And it kind of left the South hanging, and they end up getting defeated.
Wasn't America already spending a lot on Medicare and Medicaid and Head
Well,
Start?
right, and I would say you could put, that's an excellent detail. I meant to mention that for Part A. One of the things that was poorly managed was that Johnson said that he had a term, and he called it guns and butter. That in general, there was an idea that if you're going to fight a war, you're not going to have the same amount of prosperity at home. You're going to have to sacrifice at home in order to win the war. And we saw that about rationing and victory gardens and things like that during World War II and World War I. But Johnson said, no, I'm going to have guns to fight Vietnam, and we're going to have plenty of butter at home, representing that, you know, Medicare, Medicaid. We're not going to have any shortages at home. You're not going to have to do any sacrifices in terms of how you live, and we can still win the war. That obviously did not work. Johnson never really seemed to fight the war all out. He wanted to have it both ways. And so, yes, that's that's a very good thing to put into the category of being poorly managed, because they never went all out. It's almost like they were fighting the war. The U.S. kind of fought the Vietnam War with one hand behind its back. It never really tried to win the way it tried to win in other conflicts. And so that's an excellent point. And so Nixon's pulling out of troops is part of a larger strategy called détente, which is Nixon's foreign policy towards communism. Does anybody know what does détente mean? Détente. How did Nixon decide they should have relations with the communists generally? Because this is the Cold War.
It basically meant like coexistence and peace and.
Very good. Coexistence. So it went from a mindset, we're going to defeat the Soviet Union, we're going to defeat communism, we're going to hold it back, to, hey, you know what? The communists are here to stay. We better learn to get along with them. And so Nixon's policy was, we need to learn to get along with the Soviet Union and the Chinese communists because they're not going away. And so it was kind of an easing of relations. And while some people saw that as a good thing, because it felt like things weren't as tense, there'd be less conflict. Other people saw it as a terrible thing because it was the U.S. basically surrendering the moral high ground to what was a very murderous and oppressive country and ideology.
I mean, but didn't Nixon technically stop a major scale conflict by, because he kind of, they say he drove a wedge in between China and Russia, so because he went to.
Right. Well, to some extent, that wedge was already there. It's interesting. I and Tong have talked a lot about that. But that's the thing you'll mention here as part of détente is he is the first U.S. president to visit China. He goes and visits China, and that's exactly, Josh, what he's trying to do is he's trying to, rather than defeat the Chinese communists, he's trying to kind of win them over to Western capitalism. He's trying to say, hey, you know what, let's be friends. And trying to, in a sense, like you said, to divide them and win them over and say, hey, if we can make China a little bit more, if we can trade with China, if we can be friends with China, then maybe we can kind of win them over with capitalist prosperity, rather than having all these Cold War battles in places like Vietnam and Korea and Cuba. And so that's kind of the start of China is going to survive, or, you know, China's going to survive when the Soviet Union doesn't, because they actually start to adopt aspects of capitalism that the Soviet Union doesn't. And so he's basically saying, we can't win against the communists, so let's learn to kind of get along with them.
But I think the only problem with that, I mean, because didn't Nixon have good intentions, but when he went to visit, when America recognized communist China, they booted Thailand from the United Nations, and China kind of replaced.
Oh, well, and again, I don't want to, if you want, you don't necessarily have to overcomplicate this, but absolutely, no, you can trace lots of negative things to that decision with his, I think, good intentions. And again, the strategy kind of makes sense. But what has happened is now, because of that, China has incredible influence around the world. You know, prior to this, you didn't have stuff that said made in China because we weren't trading with them. Now you can see so much, again, shortages of all our medical supplies right now are dependent upon China. And China has all this influence, and yet they haven't reformed. They still have a totalitarian communist regime today. But now, rather than being isolated, they have their influence around the world. And one of the big things that's happening that you're living through, the history that you guys are living through right now, is how is the world and the US going to respond to the fact that China is extremely, their government, not necessarily Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist government is extremely corrupt and deceptive and a danger to world stability. This whole coronavirus would most likely not have got anywhere near as bad as it did if China hadn't been lying and covering it up for over a month. And so all of that is a result, down the road result, and you can maybe put some of this in your so what, of this détente mentality that, you know, communism isn't evil, it's just another way to live. And so we're going to try to kind of win them over and coexist with them. And yes, I'd say the long-term effects of that have been negative, because now China sits on the UN, it sits on the Security Council. When the US tries to sanction places like North Korea, or it tries to sanction places like Iran that are threats to world stability, China can veto those. because they have a power of influence now in the world that they wouldn't have had without what Nixon did here with détente. So there are some really big current issues going on in our world as a result of what we're talking about. We're getting pretty close to the present day. But other questions, we'll move on to culture and crisis and talk about what was going on a little bit more at home. Domestic changes. A new left and weakening constitution. Okay. You know, again, I don't know when people talk about the 1960s and 70s, what do you guys picture? What's in the pop culture?
And
you say hippies? Yeah, okay. Anything else?
Cars.
Or you say cars?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, it basically is a very transformative time in our culture. And that's what we're going to hit here in this idea that the American culture takes a huge shift in the 1960s and then the 1970s under Nixon. And that relates to kind of a couple major areas. One is the anti-war movement, and that is what we call kind of the hippie movement. And what undergirds the hippie movement is basically a rejection of authority. The hippie movement is a rejection of authority. It's kind of what was growing out of the World War I and World War II cynicism, where the idea that father knows best, you know, the idea that we should respect our elders has been completely rejected. And now it's like, you know what? Those old fogies don't know what they're doing. They're ruining our lives. We need to take control of our own lives. And so it's kind of a youth revolt movement against authority, saying that whether that's the government, whether that's the church, whether that's just parental authority, you know, or even like teacher authority, all of that begins to get upturned because, you know what, we don't trust the people in charge anymore. And so we're going to reject that. And that's what's kind of at the heart of the hippie movement and the protest movement. Alongside that comes then, what other groups were fighting for rights in the late 60s and early 70s?
Women.
Okay, so huge. So you got the rights for women, where you have the book called The Feminine Mystique. That was a really influential book that basically argued that women were being oppressed by men. It argued that marriage was an oppressive institution and that you shouldn't get married because it was just basically a way to control women. It argued for legal abortion because as long as women had to have babies or couldn't end their pregnancies or kill the babies, then they're always going to be kind of enslaved to motherhood. It argued that, you know, a woman who just stays home and takes care of her family is not doing anything useful, and they need to get out into the workplace and work a job and have a career and compete with men. And so you have this kind of this evolution in women's rights. They had the NOW organization, was the National Organization of Women, NOW. Was kind of the leader in that.
What wasn't the EPA a big thing? The Rachel Carson stuff.
Yeah. So I'm going to get to that in a second. So first, let's go to the rights movements. You got women, then you have migrant workers. So guys like Cesar Chavez and the Hispanic farm workers movement to kind of gain rights. Then you have the Native Americans, and you also have the beginning of the gay rights, LGBT movement. So you have kind of this erupting, kind of following the civil rights movement similarly for women, again, migrant workers, Native Americans, and the LGBT community. And then the last thing that's really kind of thrown into this cauldron of people questioning and changing and advocating for change is what you just mentioned, Josh, and that's the birth of the environmental movement. Earth Day was just a few days ago. I think the first Earth Day was in 1970 or so. And that was this kind of paganistic celebration that the earth was a divine and living thing, and that human beings were basically this virus that were destroying it, and we needed to take more seriously our custody of the earth. The book that was written about that was called Silent Spring, kind of basically about the fact that if we continue ignoring the environment, we're going to kill all of life. And when spring comes, there's not going to be any life. It's going to be silent because our chemicals, our pollution, our trash have completely obliterated nature. And so you get the environmental movement, and you get new organizations in the government like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or new laws like the Endangered Species Act. And so all of these things are changes going on. When we talk about the kind of the turmoil of the 1960s and 70s, those are all the different elements mixing together. Okay. The new left is now a kind of even another ingredient. Do you guys know what left and right refer to in politics? Any idea? So generically, you can say that like the right is associated with kind of conservative, kind of wanting to keep things the same or preserve things. It's
And the
typically
left
it's typically the Republican Party. It's typically in support of patriotism and the nation. Um, the left is the left is typically the Democratic Party, kind of called the Liberal Party, where they want to seek change and they want to change things. They want to upend things. They want to try new things. And so you get part of this changing policy in the culture is what we call the new left. And what this is kind of an extreme form of people who want so much change. They're basically, I would say this is the birth of American self-hatred, that they reject the Declaration of Independence. They reject the Constitution. They reject the flag. This is one of the things that starts happening very controversially in the 60s is people start burning the American flag. And there has to be whole court cases deciding, is that illegal or is that a free expression of speech and things like that, because they believe that the United States is evil and that we're hypocrites, and that basically the United States needs to be transformed, and all the institutions that we were led to believe were good things were actually really bad things. And so they challenge.
So people in our country who were legal citizens of America thought that America and the citizens of America were evil.
They thought the institutions of the United States were evil.
Oh.
They thought that they were racist. They thought that they were unequal. They thought that they were controlling and oppressive. And a lot of these people were communists. They supported the Viet Cong. They supported the Soviet Union. They thought that was the right way to go. They wanted to, again, they were anti-religion. They were anti-family. They were pro-abortion. They supported the drug culture. They began to teach this in the universities. Like for a product of this is, I don't know if you guys probably haven't heard of this thing called the 1619 Project. But what this is, you guys ever heard of the New York Times newspaper?
Yeah.
Pretty big deal, pretty famous newspaper, probably the most famous newspaper in the United States. They've been running articles for the last several months saying that America wasn't founded in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. They say that the heart of America was founded in 1619 when the first African slaves arrived, and that America primarily is a racist country, and everything that it's developed was developed in order to keep blacks enslaved and oppressed the United States. And things like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were just excuses to maintain their power and oppression of other minority groups. Those articles just won the Nobel Prize. The people saying that just recently won the Nobel Prize. And so that's what we mean by the new left. There's all of a sudden a deep, not only loss of confidence in the United States, but a kind of a growing bitterness and anger and doubt and rejection of the United States. That's part of the hippie movement and the countercultural movement.
So how did we fix it? How did things eventually get?
Well, we're going to talk about Reagan next week. I'd say that's going to be one part of it. Nixon is elected. The way Nixon plays into this, Nixon was elected by something called the silent majority, where all this stuff is being shouted about and advocated as change in the United States, and not necessarily grouping that into saying none of it was good, but it was a time of change. But then people said, you know what, that they're making a lot of noise, but most Americans still believe in America. Most Americans believe in family. Most Americans don't want abortion. Most Americans, are not using LSD. And it was those people that by electing Nixon were trying to say, we kind of want to put a stop to this revolution. We still love our country. And so, but we'll talk in our third point about what happens to that. Nixon kind of doesn't quite represent America very well, and seems to confirm and support the other side in the end. The last piece of this upheaval, and that's why this is a crisis for the United States. This is a crisis. Some people thought, that after this period, the United States was never going to rise to greatness ever again, that it was falling apart. And the third wheel of this crisis was a weakening constitution, that you had the Supreme Court basically rewriting a lot of laws within the United States and making rulings where now the Supreme Court is not just interpreting the law and letting Congress pass laws, but the Supreme Court is passing new laws. And one of the most famous is the idea of Roe v. Wade. Not necessarily because it legalized abortion, but because it forced every state to legalize abortion. States used to make their own laws on a lot of things, but this Supreme Court began to pass laws saying, no, every state has to follow all the same rules, which is not how our country was designed. If you've looked at how the coronavirus has been responded to, every state has its own policies. Every state, and even counties, they're making their own policies. But the Supreme Court during the 60s and 70s had this idea that, no, the Supreme Court's going to radically transform the entire country through new legislation. And they kind of believed, they had this idea that the Constitution, rather than being a law to which everybody, even the president and the Congress, have to obey, they kind of thought the Constitution was this thing that was always changing and evolving. They used this term, I'll type it here. They thought the Constitution was a living constitution, and that every generation got to rewrite the Constitution according to what they thought was best. And so all of a sudden, this Constitution that was kind of meant to preserve our rights and keep the government limited in its ability to interfere in our lives is now being redefined and being changed and growing in power. So that's, again, the Constitution is no longer this kind of permanent law that has to be followed by everybody, but it's being changed. And you also get the growth of the government. The government gets, continues to get bigger. In fact, again, Lyndon B. Johnson does the Great Society and, completely pile drives the federal debt. Nixon, even though he's a conservative, Nixon was a Republican, and he was elected to change things. He actually spends almost more money than Johnson does, because he knows when he's on like welfare programs.
Oh, well.
He actually increases funding for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other federal programs, because they've learned, hey, when you give people free money, they vote for you. And so he continues to, and again, he continues to grow. It's Nixon who forms the EPA. It's Nixon. You guys ever heard of affirmative action? Affirmative action is where you don't necessarily choose people for a job or college based on their abilities or their eligibility, but you choose them based on their race, because you want to make sure you have the equal fairness and representation of all the races. Or you choose people based on their gender, because you want to make sure it doesn't matter their qualifications, but you choose them based on, you're trying to have quotas of different types of people. That's something that really gains power under Nixon. And so all of these things are kind of unconstitutional. But again, that's a third thing that's being challenged in the 60s and 70s, kind of throwing things into chaos. Questions on that? We'll finish things up here.
What might you put for an intro? This is kind of not.
I would kind of talk about that. This is probably one of the greatest crises besides the Civil War in U.S. history, because again, the U.S. had never lost a war unless you counted being a Confederate and losing. The U.S. had always, its institutions, its constitutions had been considered bedrock and believed in. And even though people had political debates over what to do, there weren't people basically coming out and saying the country was evil. This is a story of crisis for the United States. It's a story of turmoil and upheaval, and kind of the country being taken in a new direction. And the final piece of that is then you have Nixon. Nixon is this isn't say silent movement, should say silent majority. As I already said, I already kind of addressed this. Nixon was kind of a counter movement for people who were fed up with all the protests and the growing drug culture and the hippie movement and the anti-Americanism. You had Nixon, supposedly he had little buttons during his campaign called the silent majority, that there was still a majority of Americans who didn't approve of this, and though they weren't on the news every night, they were going to vote in Nixon. And Nixon actually wins both of his elections very strongly. He was, in terms of being elected, he was very popular. And so he was like you said, what's going to correct this? There was a hope that Nixon would correct this. needless to say, he kind of fails, in my opinion, to do that. One, he compromises with the communists. Two, he continues to grow the power of the government, not shrink it. And then, of course, he gets caught up in the Watergate scandal. And so rather than building people's trust, he completely destroys trust in federal government. What was the Watergate scandal? Can you get some of those details?
Basically, these guys broke into the Watergate hotel and they stole like government papers, and then later they found out that Nixon, they weren't sure if they could arrest Nixon because they weren't sure if they could indict a sitting president, so they marked him as an unindicted co-conspirator. They got all this information that he was involved, and that there were audio recordings of every conversation in the Oval Office by this mysterious source called Deep Throat, which turned out to be an ex-FBI agent. I forget his name.
Okay, yeah, good. Yeah, so basically, it's kind of unfortunate because, yeah, it was a break-in of the Democratic Party's headquarters, which was in the Watergate Hotel. Nixon was up for re-election. He was elected in 68, so he's up for election 4 years later in 72. And so there's this group that he's not affiliated with, but they're supporting him. It's kind of ironic. Their acronym was CREEP, CREEP. So you've got these burglars working for an organization called CREEP. It was a committee to re-elect the president. And they break into the hotel trying to dig up dirt on the Democratic candidate and bug their phones. In other words, wiretap their phones so they can listen in on their conversations. So they get caught and indicted, and the president finds out about this. And rather than condemn them, it looks like he basically tries to cover it up. He tries to get them, make sure they plead guilty, that they take the fall, and that it doesn't spread any wider. And so what really gets Nixon into trouble is he's not directly involved in the crime, but he lies about it. I always say this again and again. If a president usually gets in trouble for anything, it's not a crime specifically, it's for lying about it afterwards. If Nixon had just condemned these guys or been honest about what was going on, he probably would have been fine. But instead, like you said, there's a mysterious, an anonymous source called Deep Throat, who kind of begins to feed information to the Washington Post, a powerful newspaper in Washington, the Washington Post. So they start running these stories, and through the course of the investigation, they do find out that the Oval Office has been recording all of its conversations, and they get a hand on those tapes, and Nixon doesn't want to release the tapes, and finally the courts order him to, and then he releases some of the tapes with some of them missing, and finally, once all the tapes come out, they have evidence that he was basically trying to cover up the crime and the president, his knowledge of the crime. And so he is going to be he is going to be impeached. He's going to be impeached. He has no congressional support. Even the Republicans can't support him once all this evidence comes out. And so he never is officially impeached, but he actually resigns before his impeachment because he just says, I'm not going to take the country through that whole process. It's clear nobody's with me. And so he resigns, and then his vice president, Gerald Ford becomes president in his place.
Wasn't that like on the same day Gerald Ford got sworn in?
Well, yeah. Well, what happened? Yeah, I mean, if a president resigns, nobody's in charge of the country, so they're going to swear in his replacement right afterwards.
Also, as part of the cover-up, I read in the book that Nixon tried to pay them what he called hush money for their silence.
Right. Yeah, he didn't want. Yeah, he was so afraid that of being seen that these guys were trying to help him get reelected. He tried to basically bribe people to be quiet. And so it wasn't the crime itself, because he wasn't even involved in that. It was how he responded to the crime, panicked and didn't just tell the truth, which is unfortunate. And the other really silly thing is it was so unnecessary. He wins that election, the one that they were worried about and these guys were getting involved in. He wins that election so easily. It was a completely pointless crime. He would have been a president free and clear and had another 4 years, no problem. But they were so insecure that they started to do illegal things. Okay, and so his actual resignation is 2 years after the initial break-in in 1974. So he's president for 2 years after this happens, but he finally resigns, and Gerald Ford comes in for 2 years. Okay, questions before we do the so what?
What's it called when like the president is gonna be like kicked out? What's that called?
Impeached.
Thank you.
Impeached, and you would say technically, if you want to, impeached and indicted. Impeached means they officially say you did something wrong, and that's what the House of Representatives does. And then the Senate would actually have a trial and decide if he's going to be convicted and kicked out of, pulled out of being president or whatever. He didn't even start that process. He resigns before that ever starts. Okay, so what we're talking about here is kind of when Josh asked about the intro, is just that the 1960s and 70s, it's a period of cultural and political chaos and crisis. Whether you've got Vietnam, you've got the social turmoil, you've got the political growth and scandals. It's a real crisis for the United States. And some people were sitting there going, the United States is finished. The United States is never going to, is falling apart. And that it's losing to the Soviet Union, and that its greatness is really in decline. And so it was a really kind of a dark period for the country. And you really kind of have these two things that will destroy a country, which is kind of a loss of national confidence. Abraham Lincoln, or even the Bible, says that the thing that's going to destroy America is no external threat, it's a threat from within. And so when we have this inner turmoil, whether it's scandal or corruption, or whether it's the new left and kind of a doubting of our Trinity, of our e pluribus unum and our liberty and our in God we trust, that was really what it was kind of rotting the United States from within. And so you had a lot of these, the Vietnam War was very winnable. It's a shame that our troops, some of those poor guys came back after horrendous duty and they were spit upon and they were called baby killers and they were hated. They fought so bravely. And they fought so well. They were just so poorly led by a government that had no confidence in them and didn't let them fight the way they could have fought, that war was lost. And so that kind of just this idea that it's not, if you lose, it's not really your circumstances that defeat you. It's your inner self. It's your own confidence. And that's what the U.S. is really struggling with. What are we about? And are we good? And is the battle for democracy and capitalism worth fighting, or should we just détente? Should we just get along with communism? Should we just learn to coexist with evil? And that's kind of where we're going to pick up our story next week. The other major big thing is just the growth of government power. And I think even in his scandal that you have, that Nixon scandal, that's a symptom of this continual coming from the Great Society and the New Deal of the federal government becoming more and more powerful, rewriting the Constitution, overriding states' laws, coming out in terms of corruption around the national election. It's just kind of people are really looking to the government to help them, but then also realizing that government is kind of out of control, and that you've got all these areas of corruption and things going on. So 1974, there's very little faith in the United States as a nation and in its government institutions. Which is kind of sad because 1976 was the 200th anniversary, and it was celebrated, but there was a lot of turmoil going on at the time. So I don't think it was quite as big of a party as it could have been. Any questions or implications? And Josh, if you want to put something in your so what about, again, the effects of détente, you could, but again, that's a kind of a big separate idea. Okay, so this is a story of losing confidence abroad in the Vietnam War, the kind of the turmoil within our own culture and our institutions, and then capping all of that off, one of the biggest presidential scandals the United States has ever experienced. Just kind of like insult to injury. You're having that bad day and you're wondering and you're doubting and you're afraid, and then all of a sudden one thing happens that just seems to bring it all home and be like, yeah, I knew this was bad. And that's kind of what the Watergate scandal was for the country. Other people looked at Watergate scandal as a good thing, in that they're like, you know what, the president did something dishonest, there was corruption going on, and he got caught. And that we're a country where the most powerful person, the president, is not above the law. So it's not all, it doesn't have to be doom and gloom. And the fact that it got investigated and that he got held accountable can be seen as a positive thing. And that we do have constitutional institutions that we're not going to have a Hitler, we're not going to have a Stalin, where somebody's allowed to do whatever they want. They're still going to be held accountable. So. Any questions? Appreciate you guys. Appreciate you guys waking up early on Fridays to come together. Did anybody watch those track races clips I sent out yesterday?
Yeah, I did.
Finish strong. We got 3 weeks to fit. It's officially 3 weeks left. We're so close. And again, one of the ideas being kicked around is, even though if we won't have classes, we might be doing like a school softball game or something. I don't know if that's something any of you guys would be interested in. That doesn't require a lot of physical contact, but just coming together and having a barbecue, or not barbecue, but food, and just still some activities where we could see each other, even though we're not having normal classes. In some ways, more fun. All right, Brianna, Eric, you guys have any questions? Russell?
Nope.
No?
I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, well, like I said, just finish strong. I know sometimes it's hard to be motivated when you're at home and you're doing the same thing. It feels like week after week. You're almost there. You're almost there. Anybody have any weekend plans?